As the ceremony drew to a close, Dr. Chen looked at the community that had grown from a single moment of courage. The college student was showing a group of high school students around the new center. The art teacher was explaining her sketches to visitors. The elderly gentleman was sharing his latest community-themed crossword puzzle. "You know what really changed that morning?" Dr. Chen asked in her closing remarks. "It wasn't just that people stood up against something wrong. It was that they stood up for something right. They showed us that community isn't just a place, it's a choice we make every day. A choice to see each other, to support each other, to turn ordinary moments into extraordinary changes." As people mingled after the ceremony, sharing stories and making new connections, the morning sun caught the windows of the community center. Inside and outside, people from all walks of life talked, laughed, and planned for the future. Route 23 still ran its regular schedule, but now it was known as a place where strangers became friends, where simple bus rides could become moments of connection, where an ordinary morning commute had sparked a lasting change in countless lives. 6 months had passed since that morning on Route 23. The autumn leaves had fallen, winter had come and gone, and now spring flowers were pushing through the soil. Outside Metropolitan Hospital, a small crowd gathered for what had become an important community event. The hospital's new community center was opening today. Its walls were decorated with the art teacher's sketches, now part of a permanent installation called The Morning That Changed Us. The quiet woman who had first spoken up about her brother stood near the entrance, greeting people with a confidence that would have surprised her former self. Dr. Chen approached the podium, her white coat catching the morning breeze. The crowd included familiar faces, the college student now in her first year of medical school, the elderly gentleman with a fresh crossword puzzle tucked in his pocket, the art teacher whose sketches had touched so many hearts. But there were new faces too, people who had heard the story and felt drawn to be part of this growing community. 6 months ago, Dr. Chen began, her voice carrying across the courtyard. "I was just a doctor trying to get to work. What happened that morning could have been just another sad story about hatred and bias. But you all chose to make it something different." She paused, looking at the faces before her. "You turned a moment of darkness into a spark of light that keeps growing." The new community center wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of transformation. Inside, there was a free clinic staffed by volunteer medical professionals. The quiet woman ran a support group for patients' families. The art teacher held classes where people could express their experiences through creativity. The elderly gentleman had a special corner where he taught others how to solve crossword puzzles and, more importantly, how to connect with strangers through shared activities. The college student, who now mentored high school students interested in medicine, stood up to share her story. "That video went viral," she said, "but what really went viral was hope. In my medical school interviews, they didn't just ask about my grades. They asked about that morning, about what it taught me about community health, about standing up for what's right." A city council member stepped forward with an announcement. The transit authority had completely revamped its training program. New drivers now spent time volunteering in the communities they served. Route 23 had become a model for community engagement, with other cities sending representatives to learn from their example. The elderly gentleman's crossword corner had become something special. He created puzzles that celebrated local heroes, not just doctors and nurses, but also the cleaning staff who kept hospitals safe, the bus drivers who got people to their appointments, the volunteers who held strangers' hands during difficult moments. The art teacher's students had created a mural on one wall of the community center. It showed a bus transformed into a garden, with flowers growing from every window, symbolizing how beauty could bloom in unexpected places. Below it, people wrote their own stories of times when strangers had become friends, when differences had become bridges instead of barriers. Mrs. Rodriguez, the patient whose surgery had been scheduled for that fateful morning, was there too. She had fully recovered and now volunteered at the center, sharing her story with others facing similar challenges. "Dr. Chen didn't just fix my heart," she told people. "She showed me how a whole community could have heart." The quiet woman's support group had grown beyond anything she could have imagined. People came not just for medical support, but for the sense of belonging, the reminder that they weren't alone. Sometimes, she would say, finding your voice is about more than speaking up. It's about helping others find their voices too. Near the end of the ceremony, a surprise visitor arrived, the transit supervisor who had intervened that morning. She brought news that touched everyone's hearts. The Transit Authority had created a scholarship program for underprivileged students pursuing careers in healthcare or community service. They named it the Route 23 Scholarship, and the first recipient was a young person who had been inspired by the story to become a doctor. The college student who had been accepted into medical school, partly based on her personal essay about that morning, started a mentorship program. She connected young people interested in healthcare with medical professionals, breaking down barriers and building bridges across communities. The art teacher's classroom became a space for more than just art. Her students learned about composition and color theory through the lens of social justice and community building. The sketches from that morning hung on her classroom wall, not as a reminder of hatred, but as proof that beauty can emerge from difficult moments. Even the transit supervisor's role had evolved. She now led workshops for other cities' transit authorities, sharing how one incident had transformed their entire approach to community engagement. It's not just about getting people from point A to point B, she would say. It's about creating safe spaces for everyone, about understanding that every interaction is an opportunity to build community. The elderly gentleman's crossword puzzles took on new meaning. He started creating custom puzzles about community heroes, featuring clues about local people who made a difference. These puzzles appeared in the hospital newsletter, giving patients and staff a different way to connect and reflect. Social media continued to spread the story, but not in the usual viral way that focuses on conflict and drama. Instead, people shared stories of their own bus moments, times when communities came together, when strangers became allies, when ordinary people chose to stand up for what's right. As autumn turned to winter, the impact of that morning continued to ripple outward. The hospital's waiting room had become a warmer place, with volunteers from the Route 23 family group offering support to worried families. The bus route itself had become known as the community line, with regular passengers looking out for each other in small but meaningful ways. A week after the bus incident, the story had taken on a life of its own. The college student's video had reached millions of views, but what happened next surprised everyone. Instead of fading away like most viral stories, it sparked a movement that spread far beyond their city limits. The local news station's website crashed twice from the traffic after they posted their in-depth coverage. But they weren't reporting on the confrontation anymore. They were telling stories about what happened after. About how the quiet woman from the bus had started a support group for families of heart patients. About how the elderly gentleman with his crossword puzzles now volunteered at the hospital, solving puzzles with nervous patients in waiting rooms. The art teacher's sketches from that morning had been turned into a traveling exhibition called Moments of Unity. It started in the hospital lobby but quickly spread to other venues, schools, community centers, even City Hall. Each sketch captured something different. The determination in Dr. Chen's eyes, the solidarity of the standing passengers, the way morning light had streamed through the bus windows during those tense moments. One morning, the hospital's administrative staff gathered for an unexpected meeting. The chief of staff stood before them, holding a stack of letters. "We've received hundreds of these," he said, his voice thick with emotion. People sharing their own stories of discrimination in healthcare settings. But more importantly, they're sharing stories of hope, of medical professionals who made them feel seen, respected, valued. The college student's social media following had grown exponentially, but she used her platform differently than most viral sensations. She started a series called Everyday Heroes, featuring stories of people standing up for others in small but significant ways. Her first video? A feature about the quiet woman from the bus who had gone from being too shy to speak to becoming a powerful advocate for patient rights. In the Transit Authority's training center, things had changed dramatically. New drivers watched the bus video as part of their orientation, but not to learn what went wrong. Instead, they learned about the passengers who stepped up, about community responsibility, about the difference between being a driver and being part of a community. Dr. Chen's hospital rounds became something special. Patients would share stories they'd heard about the bus incident, but they weren't focused on the negative parts. They talked about the art teacher's sketches, about the elderly gentleman's crosswords, about the way strangers had become defenders. Some patients even recognized their fellow bus passengers in the halls, leading to touching reunions and shared smiles. The Quiet Woman's Route 23 family group had grown beyond just the bus passengers. It became a movement, with chapters starting in other cities. Their mission was simple: create communities of support in everyday spaces. They organized everything from hospital volunteer programs to transportation buddy systems for elderly and disabled passengers. Local businesses along Route 23 started putting up signs. "All are welcome here," and "Community stands together." The coffee shop where some of the bus passengers now met regularly created a special drink called the Unity Blend, with proceeds going to medical student scholarships for underprivileged youth. At the hospital's monthly board meeting, Dr. Chen was asked to speak. She stood at the podium, looking out at faces both familiar and new. "What happened that morning wasn't just about one person facing discrimination," she said. "It was about a community deciding what kind of world they wanted to live in. They chose unity over division, action over apathy, love over hate." The Transit Authority's investigation moved swiftly. Wallace's employment was terminated by afternoon, but more importantly, new policies were being drafted. Sensitivity training would be mandatory, not just a checkbox on a form. A passenger advocacy group would be formed, with the elderly gentleman from the bus invited to serve as one of its first members. As evening approached, Dr. Chen finished her last surgery of the day. Mrs. Rodriguez was recovering well, surrounded by her loving family. In the recovery room, the art teacher's sketch hung on the wall, a simple yet powerful reminder of how a community had come together that morning. The hospital's chief of staff stopped by as Dr. Chen was preparing to leave. "You know," he said, "what happened today? It's bigger than just one incident. It's about who we are as a community, as healthcare providers, as human beings." He paused, looking at the stream of people still coming in to show support. Sometimes the best medicine isn't found in a prescription or a procedure. Sometimes it's found in moments like this, when people choose to stand together. Outside, the evening sun painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. The same bus stop where everything had started looked different now, not just a place to wait for transportation, but a symbol of something more. A place where a group of strangers had chosen to become a community, where silence had given way to solidarity, where an ordinary morning had transformed into an extraordinary lesson about the power of standing up for what's right. By mid-morning, the incident had already begun spreading across social media. The college student's video, filmed with steady hands and a clear view, was being shared thousands of times. But unlike many viral videos that focus on conflict, this one was different. People weren't just sharing the confrontation, they were sharing the response, the way a bus full of strangers had become a united force for good. At the Transit Authority office, things were moving quickly. The supervisor sat at her desk, reviewing multiple videos and statements from passengers. Her computer screen showed Wallace's employment history, a pattern of complaints that had somehow slipped through the cracks during his hiring. She rubbed her temples, thinking about the changes needed in their screening process. Meanwhile, at Metropolitan Hospital, Dr. Chen was preparing for Mrs. Rodriguez's surgery. Her hands were steady as she scrubbed in, the familiar routine helping to center her thoughts. A young nurse approached her in the prep room, phone in hand. "Doctor, have you seen? The videos everywhere. People are calling you a hero." Dr. Chen smiled gently behind her surgical mask. "The real heroes were the passengers," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Ordinary people who chose to do the extraordinary." She thought about the elderly gentleman with his crossword puzzle, the teacher with her art supplies, the college student with her phone, and the quiet woman who found her voice when it mattered most. Outside the operating room, something unexpected was happening. The hospital's waiting area was filling with familiar faces, passengers from the bus coming to show support. The art teacher had brought coffee for everyone. The elderly gentleman was sharing his crossword puzzles with nervous family members waiting for news about their loved ones. The quiet woman was helping someone fill out admission forms. The college student, still clutching her phone, had been invited to speak with the hospital's administration. Her video wasn't just going viral, it was starting conversations about healthcare access, about respect, about the everyday heroes who walk among us. The hospital's Diversity and Inclusion Committee was already planning to use it in their training programs. Back in the Transit Authority office, the supervisor was on a conference call with the city council. "This isn't just about one incident," she explained, her voice firm. "This is about systematic change. We need better training, better screening, better support for our drivers and passengers alike." On her desk, next to stacks of incident reports, lay the art teacher's sketch of the scene, a powerful reminder of why this mattered. The local news had picked up the story, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of focusing on the conflict, they were highlighting the community's response. Interviews were being conducted with passengers who had stood up that morning. Each one had a different perspective, a different reason for speaking up, but they all shared one common thread: the belief that standing together against hatred was not just an option, but a responsibility. In the hospital cafeteria, during a brief break between surgeries, Dr. Chen found herself surrounded by colleagues and staff members. A young resident approached her, eyes bright with admiration. "You know," the resident said, "I chose this hospital for my training because I heard it was a place where everyone was treated with respect." Today proved that's true not just in the hospital, but in our whole community. The quiet woman who had spoken up about her brother had started a social media group for the bus passengers. She named it Route 23 Family, because that's what they had become. Plans were already being made for monthly meetups, community service projects, and a mentoring program for young people interested in healthcare careers. Dr. Chen stood up slowly, gathering her medical bag. The weight of it felt different now, somehow lighter yet more significant. "Before we all go our separate ways," she said, her voice steady and warm, "I want you to know something. In my years of practicing medicine, I've learned that healing isn't just about procedures and medications. It's about community. It's about people coming together to support each other. What you all did today, that's a different kind of healing." The morning light streamed through the bus windows, catching dust motes in its beams, making them dance like tiny stars. Outside, the world was continuing its daily rhythm: cars passing, people walking, life moving forward. But inside this bus, something had shifted. Boundaries had dissolved, strangers had become allies, and a simple morning commute had transformed into a powerful reminder of humanity's capacity for good. As they prepared to transfer to the new bus, people exchanged phone numbers and social media contacts. The art teacher promised to share her sketches. The college student offered to send everyone the video. The quiet woman suggested they all meet for coffee sometime. In the face of ugliness, they had created something beautiful, a spontaneous community bound together by a shared experience and a common stand for dignity. Outside the bus, the morning had transformed into something entirely unexpected. The transit supervisor was speaking firmly with Wallace, whose bravado had deflated like a punctured balloon. The two police officers stood nearby, taking statements from passengers who had witnessed everything from the beginning. Phones were still recording, capturing every moment of what had become much more than just a morning commute incident. But inside the bus, something even more remarkable was unfolding. The elderly gentleman who'd been doing his crossword puzzle earlier was now sharing his own story. "You know," he said, his voice gentle but carrying clearly through the bus, "I was born in 1955. I've seen hatred up close. I've seen what it does to people, both those who carry it and those who face it. But I've also seen how things can change when good people stand together." The young college student, still holding her phone steady, wiped away tears with her free hand. Her textbook lay forgotten on the seat beside her, its pages filled with highlights and notes about biology and chemistry, perhaps the first steps toward her own dream of becoming a doctor, inspired by Dr. Chen's example. The quiet woman who had spoken up about her brother's heart attack was now sitting next to Dr. Chen, holding her hand. "When my brother collapsed that day at the grocery store," she said, her voice stronger now, "I thought that was it. But you didn't hesitate. You didn't even know us, but you jumped in to help. You kept talking to him, keeping him calm, while doing what needed to be done. That's what real professionals do. They help people, no questions asked." Outside, more transit authority vehicles had arrived. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting shorter shadows now. Regular commuters walked past, slowing down to watch the scene unfold. Some stopped to ask questions, and soon the story was spreading through the growing crowd like ripples in a pond. The art teacher had taken out her sketchbook and was capturing the scene in quick, emotional strokes. Sometimes, she said, not looking up from her drawing, The most important lessons don't happen in classrooms. My students need to know about days like this, about people like all of you who stood up for what's right. Dr. Chen checked her phone again. The hospital had sent several messages, and she knew her patients were waiting. Mrs. Rodriguez's surgery couldn't be delayed much longer. But something extraordinary was happening here, something that felt just as important as any medical procedure. A new bus had pulled up behind them, ready to take the passengers on to their destinations. The replacement driver, an older woman with kind eyes, was already on board, waiting patiently. But nobody moved. It was as if this moment, this space, had become sacred somehow, a testament to human dignity and solidarity. The transit supervisor stepped back onto the bus, her face showing a mix of professionalism and emotion. "Dr. Chen," she said, "we've arranged for immediate transport to the hospital for you and anyone else who needs to get there urgently." Then, addressing the whole bus, she added, "What happened here today? Well, it's going to lead to some changes in our training programs." The college student finally lowered her phone, her hands shaking slightly. "I got everything," she said. "Every word, every moment. People need to see this, not the hate, but what came after. How everyone stood up, how a random group of strangers became something more." The elderly gentleman folded his newspaper carefully, tucking his pen into his pocket. "You know what the real story is here?" he asked, looking around at everyone. "It's not about one angry man. It's about all of us. Look around. Every age, every background, all of us choosing to do what's right. That's the story that needs to be told." The atmosphere in the bus shifted. Wallace's face changed from red to pale in an instant. The reality of his actions, now documented by dozens of phones and witnessed by a bus full of passengers, seemed to finally hit him. Dr. Chen remained seated, her hands steady in her lap. Years of handling medical emergencies had taught her the value of staying calm in crisis situations. She watched as the supervisor boarded the bus, noting how the woman's trained eyes quickly assessed the situation. "Dr. Chen," the supervisor said, recognition in her voice, "my mother was your patient last spring. That bypass surgery you performed," she paused, emotion briefly crossing her face. "Well, she's doing great now, playing with her grandkids again." The irony of the moment wasn't lost on anyone. Here was yet another life touched by the very doctor whose credentials Wallace had tried to dismiss. The supervisor turned to Wallace, her expression now professional and stern. "Step outside, please. We need to have a discussion about transit authority policies and professional conduct." As Wallace stumbled off the bus, muttering under his breath, something beautiful happened. The passengers, still standing, began to share more stories. The college student talked about how Dr. Chen had inspired her to apply to medical school. The teacher mentioned the time she'd seen the doctor giving her lunch to a homeless person outside the hospital. Through it all, Dr. Chen sat quietly, touched by the outpouring of support but concerned about her patients. When she finally spoke, her words were characteristically thoughtful. "Thank you all," she said, looking around at the faces of people who had become more than just fellow commuters. "But right now, there are people at the hospital who need us, all of us. Teachers, students, everyone here has somewhere important to be. That's what community is about, showing up for each other." The tension in the bus had reached a breaking point. Wallace's face had turned an alarming shade of red as he twisted in his seat to face the passengers. His next words came out like venom, each one deliberately chosen to hurt. "You people can make up all the stories you want," he spat, "but I know what's real and what's not. I've been driving buses for 15 years, and I've seen every trick in the book." Dr. Chen took a deep breath, the same way she did before beginning a difficult surgery. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, probably the hospital wondering why she wasn't there yet. The lives waiting for her care felt impossibly far away at this moment, separated by much more than just physical distance. "Sir," she said, her voice clear and professional, the same tone she used to calm anxious patients, "I understand you're having a difficult morning. But there are people at the hospital who need medical care. This isn't about you or me anymore." She reached into her bag and pulled out her hospital ID badge, its official hologram catching the morning light. "If you'd like to file a complaint about my pass, you're welcome to do so through proper channels. But right now, we all need to get to where we're going." The college student's phone continued recording, its small red light a steady reminder that everything was being documented. Other passengers had their phones out too, some typing frantically, others capturing the scene. In the age of social media, injustice rarely went unnoticed. Wallace's response was to laugh, a harsh sound that made several passengers flinch. "Oh, so now you're giving me orders?" Plain doctor with a fancy badge. He stood up from his seat, something no bus driver should ever do while on duty. "Let me tell you what I think about your fancy badge." That's when something remarkable happened. The quiet woman from the back of the bus suddenly spoke up again, her voice stronger now. "My brother," she said, standing up, "the one Dr. Chen saved. He had a heart attack right in front of me. I thought I was watching him die. But she was there, at the grocery store of all places, and she knew exactly what to do. She saved his life while waiting for the ambulance. She didn't ask for recognition. She didn't even tell anyone she was a doctor until she needed to." The elderly gentleman with his crossword puzzle stood up too, positioning himself in the aisle. "I've seen her at the hospital at 3 a.m., still checking on patients, still smiling, still caring." His voice carried the weight of wisdom that comes with age. "Son," he addressed Wallace, "you're on the wrong side of history here." One by one, passengers began to stand. The teacher with her art supplies, the college student with her phone, even people who had never spoken to Dr. Chen but had witnessed her quiet dedication day after day. They'd formed an impromptu wall of humanity, a living barrier between Wallace and the doctor he seemed determined to intimidate. Outside, more passengers were gathering, drawn by the commotion and delay. Some were on their phones, presumably calling the transit authority. Others were recording through the windows. The morning sun cast their shadows long across the bus floor, creating a strange dance of light and darkness. Wallace took a step forward, his face contorted with anger. "You're all being fooled," he shouted. "This is exactly what's wrong with this country. Everyone falling for." But he never finished that sentence. A new voice cut through the tension, firm, authoritative, and coming from outside the bus. "Transit supervisor here. Is there a problem?" A woman in a blue uniform was standing at the door, her badge gleaming. Behind her, 2 police officers were approaching, having been called by concerned citizens. But before he could continue, something unexpected happened. The college student who had been quietly recording spoke up. "Actually, Dr. Chen performed my grandmother's heart surgery last year." Her voice trembled slightly but grew stronger with each word. "She stayed with our family for 3 hours after the operation, explaining everything, making sure we understood the recovery process. She's the reason my grandmother is still alive." Other voices joined in, a chorus of support rising from the passengers. The teacher mentioned how Dr. Chen had once helped a student having an asthma attack at the bus stop. The elderly gentleman spoke about seeing her at the hospital, working late into the night. Even a quiet woman in the back, who had never spoken during any previous commute, shared how Dr. Chen had helped her brother during a cardiac emergency. The bus had become more than just a vehicle. It was now a courtroom of sorts, with the regular passengers serving as witnesses to both the injustice unfolding and the remarkable impact one person could have on a community. Through it all, Dr. Chen sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her posture straight but not rigid, her expression composed but not distant. Outside, more passengers had gathered, some peering through the windows, others pulling out their phones. The morning sun continued its journey upward, casting long shadows through the bus windows. The hospital tower loomed in the distance, its windows glinting like beckoning beacons. Somewhere in that building, patients were waiting, lives were hanging in the balance, and time, precious, crucial time, was slipping away. Wallace's grip on the steering wheel tightened even further, his face reddening with each passing moment. The situation was balancing on a knife's edge, and everyone could feel it. The next few minutes would determine not just how this morning would unfold, but how this story would be told. A story about dignity in the face of prejudice, about a community's capacity to stand together, and about the choices people make when confronted with their own biases. The moment Dr. Chen stepped toward the bus, something felt deeply wrong. The new driver's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white, and his jaw was clenched in a way that made the other regular passengers shift uncomfortably. This wasn't the warm welcome they were used to from their usual driver, Mr. Thompson, who had become more like a friend than a bus operator over the years. The morning light caught the driver's name tag, which read Wallace. He watched Dr. Chen through the rearview mirror as she held up her monthly pass, the same pass she'd shown hundreds of times before. But instead of the usual quick nod, Wallace's finger hovered over the door control. Just as she was about to step up, the doors suddenly snapped shut, nearly catching the sleeve of her white coat. A collective gasp rose from the other passengers. The kind-faced teacher who always rode in the front seat quickly gathered her art supplies, ready to speak up. The elderly gentleman with his crossword puzzle lowered his reading glasses, peering over them with concern. The college student closed her textbook with a sharp snap, all pretense of studying forgotten. "Excuse me," Dr. Chen said calmly, her voice steady despite the unexpected situation. "I believe there's been a mistake. I have a valid pass." She held it up again, the plastic catching the morning sun. The pass that had never failed her in 3 years of commuting suddenly felt like an inadequate shield against the hostility radiating from behind the driver's window. Wallace reopened the doors with deliberate slowness, letting out a heavy sigh that seemed designed to make Dr. Chen feel like an inconvenience. "These passes," he muttered, just loud enough for everyone to hear. "They give them to anybody these days." His words hung in the air like smoke, toxic and suffocating. As Dr. Chen stepped onto the bus, she felt the weight of every pair of eyes. Some passengers looked away uncomfortably, while others watched with growing concern. The college student had pulled out her phone, pretending to text but clearly recording the situation. Smart girl, Dr. Chen thought, remembering similar incidents she'd heard about where documentation had made all the difference. Walking down the aisle, Dr. Chen spotted an empty seat near the middle of the bus. The morning sun streamed through the windows, creating patterns on the blue fabric seats. Such a beautiful morning for such an ugly situation, she thought. Her medical bag felt heavier than usual as she made her way forward, each step measured and dignified. "You know," Wallace's voice cut through the silence, his words aimed at no one in particular but clearly meant for everyone to hear. "There was a time when people knew their place. When real professionals, you know, the kind who actually earned their positions, got the respect they deserved." The bus remained motionless at the stop, the engine idling roughly. A few more passengers waiting outside began to fidget nervously, unsure whether to board. The morning schedule, so crucial to everyone's daily routine, was already falling apart. Dr. Chen thought about Mrs. Rodriguez waiting for her surgery, about the residents who would soon gather for their morning rounds, about all the patients counting on her. The elderly gentleman cleared his throat. "Young man," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience, "I believe we're running behind schedule." His crossword puzzle lay forgotten on his lap, his pen poised like a tiny sword ready for battle. Wallace's response was to adjust his mirror, deliberately catching Dr. Chen's reflection. "Oh, we'll get going when I'm good and ready. Some people need to learn that they can't just walk in anywhere they please, waving around passes and certificates like they mean something." The teacher in the front seat stood up, her art supplies clutched to her chest like armor. "Sir, this is completely inappropriate. Dr. Chen is a respected doctor." Wallace interrupted with a harsh laugh. "Right, and I'm the Surgeon General." He turned in his seat, his face twisted with unveiled contempt. "Let me tell you something about these so-called professionals." The crisp autumn morning painted the city streets in shades of gold and orange as leaves danced their way down to the sidewalk. At exactly 7:15 a.m., just like every other weekday for the past 3 years, Dr. Chen stood at the bus stop on Cedar Avenue, her white coat catching the early morning breeze. She wasn't just any doctor, she was one of Metropolitan Hospital's finest cardiologists, known for her gentle demeanor and brilliant mind. That morning felt different somehow. Maybe it was the way the clouds hung low in the sky, or perhaps it was the unusual quiet at the normally bustling bus stop. Dr. Chen scrolled through her phone, checking patient updates from the night shift. Her mind wandered to Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly patient scheduled for bypass surgery later that day. The previous evening, she had spent an extra hour explaining the procedure to Mrs. Rodriguez's worried grandchildren, drawing simple diagrams on a notepad to help them understand. The familiar weight of her medical bag rested against her leg, filled with patient files she'd reviewed late into the night. Inside was also a slightly squished brown paper bag containing her lunch, homemade dumplings, a recipe passed down from her grandmother. She always packed extra, knowing the young nurses in the cardiac unit loved sharing her home-cooked meals during their hectic shifts. A group of regulars had gathered at the stop by now: the kind-faced teacher who always carried bright-colored art supplies, the elderly gentleman with his crossword puzzle book, and the young college student who somehow managed to read thick textbooks while standing. They'd formed an unspoken morning community over the years, exchanging small nods and gentle smiles, sharing umbrellas on rainy days, and holding spots in line for one another. Dr. Chen checked her watch again, 7:22 a.m. Route 23 was running a bit late today. Usually, Mr. Thompson, the regular driver, would pull up at 7:20 sharp, greeting everyone with his trademark "Good morning, folks," and friendly wave. She'd grown used to his punctuality and warm personality, often chatting with him about his daughter, who dreamed of becoming a doctor herself. The hospital tower loomed in the distance, its windows catching the morning sun. Dr. Chen thought about her upcoming day: 3 consultations, 2 follow-ups, Mrs. Rodriguez's surgery, and a meeting with new residents. She loved teaching young doctors, showing them that medicine wasn't just about memorizing procedures and prescribing medications. It was about connecting with people, understanding their stories, and treating each patient like family. A slight commotion drew her attention. Other passengers were looking down the street, where an unfamiliar bus was approaching. The vehicle seemed to lumber forward more aggressively than usual, and even from a distance, something felt off about the way it was being driven. The electronic display board on the front flickered erratically between Route 23 and jumbled numbers. Dr. Chen adjusted her coat and picked up her bag, stepping closer to the curb as she had done hundreds of times before. The morning sun warmed her face as she waited, unaware that in the next few minutes, her routine commute would transform into something that would touch lives across the city and beyond. The bus drew closer, and now she could see that instead of Mr. Thompson's familiar face, there was someone else behind the wheel, someone whose expression made her instinctively tighten her grip on her medical bag. The vehicle came to an abrupt stop, the brakes squealing much louder than necessary. The doors opened with a harsh hiss, and the unfamiliar driver's eyes met hers. That moment, that single frozen moment when their eyes locked, would later be described by witnesses as the calm before the storm. Dr. Chen, with 15 years of medical experience and countless emergency situations under her belt, felt something she rarely experienced: uncertainty. But like the countless times she'd faced challenging situations in the operating room, she stood her ground, ready to face whatever came next. Little did she know, this ordinary Thursday morning would become a story that would touch hearts, challenge minds, and remind an entire city about the power of standing up for what's right. But most importantly, it would show how a community could come together in the most unexpected ways, proving that sometimes the worst situations can bring out the best in people.